Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
Our freedom don't come free, but it's worth the price we pay. The dream inside us all, it cannot be denied. Together let us raise up freedom's flag and let it fly.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering sum of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end. but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there's something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high planes of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone, and as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always move ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, well, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highway and the hotels of the city. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We can never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Now, I am not unmindful that many of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Many of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Many of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to the slums and the ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racist, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and if America's to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightened Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Well, I don't know if it's just my pregnancy hormones or what, but hearing that is very emotional. And in my mind, I was listening in two ways. One way, I was taking myself back, imagining hearing it when he was delivering it under a system where there was structural inequality, racism, and so forth. And then I was also listening to those words, wondering how they apply today, how African Americans, and specifically what meaning they have to them today. So I'm wondering if you can start this off by giving us your take on what that speech means to our country today.
Well, thank you. What that speech means today, well, let me go back a little bit in context. That was the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's why he said 100 years later. And of course, the backdrop was the Lincoln Memorial, who Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And basically what it was saying, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law and it freed slaves, that they still were not free. They were free on paper, but in reality, they were not free. And so what it means today, I think it allows people to go back and to really look at where we are today and where we were then, and the improvements that we made and the improvements that need to be made today. So I think it invigorates or reinvigorates a sense of reality to where we are as a nation as it relates to race, religion, relates to race relations. So I think we can really gain a lot out of what Dr. King said then, still today.
And on that note, where are we today? From the outside, looking at it from the media perspective, race relations, we're in a very difficult spot.
We are. We are in a difficult spot, and I think that in order to really move forward, that there's certain things that we have to do in order to move forward. It's continuing. It's in a sense the same way that it has been in many instances, but it has been covered with complexities and niceties and things of that nature. So I think we have to be real. I enjoyed the message on yesterday, how they were talking about facts and reality and putting it into context. And if we don't look at the facts and we look at only at the political structure of it, then we are doing ourselves a disservice as it relates to making a difference.
So one of the most famous lines from that speech, of course, is, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." I think this is something that every conservative in this room still values today. But looking at the way identity politics has really run rampant in our country, I feel that conservatives and liberals see this idea in 2 very different ways. And how do we come together and acknowledge that being African American, the color of your skin, just like me being a woman, me being a mom is part of my identity, that's going to be part of their identity. But we've seen identity politics, in my argument, go way too far in some cases, where it's reflected in our policies, reflected in our culture, and I think torn the country apart.
I totally agree. I really think that politics oftentimes gets in the way, and it disturbs us. If King's reality, the path that King laid out was really a path of God. His path was, he was first and foremost a minister of the gospel. If we see him as just a civil rights leader, then we've missed the vast majority, or the whole concept of who Dr. King was. And so he stood for justice, he stood for peace, and it was something like what you would hear, what would Jesus do? And that was King's piece, and he related directly to that. As you notice, Martin Luther King Jr. never ran for office. He certainly could have won in many instances, but he never ran. He didn't want to get tied into the political arena because it was so divisive. And when you have your own thoughts, and me myself personally, I don't get deep into it because sometimes it causes you to go to one side. And I think that's what's continuously dividing us, because you have Republican, Democrat, black, white, gay, straight, male, female, and it's all divisive. And when you include the political piece of it, then it continues to get divisive. But if you stand on the Word of God and what Dr. King stood for, then you realize that it's about people. It's not about the color of your skin. It's about who you are. We have to get back to humanity and not the differences that we have.
So that so that sounds like your kind of take on the situation, and some audience members might not know this, but you have permission to actually kind of interpret MLK, his thinking, what he might be saying today. What do you think how do you think he would respond to that question of, are we judging people based on the content of their character or the color of their skin?
We continue to do that. We continue to look at people based on their color, their religion, their ethnicity, their social status. We continue to do that, and King, I believe, would continue to say that that's not how we can look at it, or we should look at it, because that continues to divide us. And we're not the divided states of America, we're the United States of America. So let us be who we call ourselves.
As I continue with my questions, I welcome anything from the audience. Please feel free to write it down. But this is such an interesting career that you have. So you are also a minister.
Yes.
And how did you get into this line of work?
To be honest with you, it kind of just, I used to DJ. Yeah, I know. I was a DJ, and I got the job because I have different personality. I can transform my voice onto different people. And, and so one day I was doing Martin Luther King Jr. and performing as him, and we was kind of cutting in some "I Have a Dream." And my friend heard me emulating Dr. King, and he said, you really sound like Dr. King. You should really consider taking this to another level, because there are many people who are living today who were not here when Dr. King was here. Dick Gregory saw me one day at an event where I spoke in Selma, and he said to me that 50% of the people living in America were not even born when Dr. King delivered that speech. 75% of the people in the world were not even born. So they don't really know Dr. King. They don't know the words that he delivered. So it was kind of a point where I just kind of fell into it. But then I began to realize, as I delved deeper into the philosophy and the theology of Dr. King, I realized that it was a calling on my life to recreate those words of Dr. King. He never lived to see 40. He was 39 years old. I think God is using me and speaking through me to reinvigorate those words that Dr. King spoke during that time.
Okay.
Oh. My question is, why do opportunists like the Reverend Sharpton and others hold forth in the black community when it's quite apparent they've done much better for themselves than anything they've done for the community? What keeps them in the positions that they're in?
I can't speak for them. I know, as far as Reverend Al Sharpton, and I know him personally, but he is a person who stands up for injustice. And when we see with this piece that we just saw with Eric Garner in New York, everybody saw the chokehold that was illegal, that killed the man. I mean, the whole world saw it. But just a few weeks ago, 5 years later, the police chief says that he's guilty. And so when you see things of these, and there's so many more, but when you see things of that nature, you have to stand up and say, this isn't right. This is wrong. Al Sharpton has, I think, has done a yeoman's job as it relates to standing up for those who do not have a voice, because he has a platform to do so. So that's pretty much my answer. I can't speak for him himself, but when right is right and wrong is wrong, regardless of who you are, what you believe in, right is right and wrong is wrong. And if it's wrong, you have an obligation and a duty to stand up for it.
As an individual born in Mexico and that chose to be an American, I want to say thank you for such a powerful moment. It was amazing. Now, this question is out of respect and concern for those that have disadvantages like African Americans and face challenges like Hispanics. What do you think Dr. King would say about public policies like affirmative action that actively judge my fellow Hispanics and your fellow African Americans, members of society, based on the color of our skin and not the content of a character?
You know, that is a contentious subject because you have to really put it in its context. I was asked the question yesterday, something similar. I think it was, you had mentioned about Obama and the ruling that he had made to make school suspensions less, and that was based more so on the color of the skin and not the behavior of the child. So it's pretty much in the same context. But if you look at it contextually, when you see that African Americans, when you see that Latinos and others have been targeted disproportionately, then, and those are facts, as we were talking about the facts on yesterday, then you have to look at an avenue that will allow them to get that, what we would call freedom, in the same way. So I don't think it's based on the color of the skin. It is to an extent, but it's more so based on the disproportionate lack of education that has been historically a part of this nation.
I think this speaks to a larger question about government's role. You know, the Obama era policy that we were chatting about yesterday that I mentioned as I was losing my breath on the last panel refers to, you know, minority students were being suspended and expelled at disproportionately higher rates than white students. There's no evidence that this was happening simply because of their skin color. And now the pendulum, that said, there were a lot of both conservatives and liberals who saw this, and nobody wants students, black, brown, white, to end up in prison to begin with. But the pendulum has swung so far in the opposite direction where it's now based on numbers rather than behaviors and individuals. And that's why when I think about it in the context of this speech, I wonder, is now our federal government correcting itself far too far in the opposite direction where it is making policies based on the color of people's skin?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, anytime you involve politics and start involving the political arena, then you begin to kind of lose focus of reality, in my opinion. I think, and as you said before, it was based on fact and based on findings that we're seeing. One of Dr. King's first thing, if you read the letter from the Birmingham jail, he says, in any nonviolent direct action campaign, there are 4 basic steps. The first step was collection of the facts to determine whether injustice existed to begin with. And once you determine whether the injustice exists, and then you can move forward with negotiation and trying to negotiate and to work it out. And if not, then you go into the direct action piece, the nonviolent direct action piece. So I don't believe that it was based on, it came out as a result of findings that they were being disproportionately suspended, and that's fact.
Based on their behavior. There's no evidence that it was simply because of their race. They were finding African American students were acting out, breaking policies, breaking laws inside and outside the classroom at higher rates than white students.
Right. That's that take on it. And the other take is that was not the case. And when they see that, when you see that that was a reality as it relates to the students, and the word disproportionately means that it was not right, basically. Yes, of course, there are many students of all colors who act out, and when you see that, just like in law enforcement, we've seen across the nation where, blacks have been stopped and have been, disproportionately, and our government has made it to where they have to reconstruct, or they're forced to. So that was something that was going on that was not right, and so it was a way of writing. I don't believe that our government should be doing certain things, and as I stick to with Dr. King, the fact that when you do that, it begins to continue to divide us.
We have one in the back here.
Hi there.
Over here.
As a white feminist, I am now doing anti-racism work on myself and learning about where I have racial bias. And I'm learning from black women. And I think we've learned so much from Dr. King, and I wonder if we should be listening to black women especially. There's one in Denver right now, and instead of white people on race.
So your question is who we should be listening to? Yes. I think that we should be listening to all. And the reason I say that is because the only way that you can get a clear determination or a clear solution to the problem is by seeing everyone's side and seeing everyone's aspect. When they did the nonviolent piece and they did the nonviolent marches and began to really try to work with what was going on during the civil rights movement, they met. And the thing about it is, it doesn't matter who is involved, everybody has to be at the table. If you're going into a city and you want to deal with gang violence, you got to have gang members at the table. You've got to have, if you're dealing with racism, you got to have whites, black, Puerto Ricans, Latino. I mean, you have to have everyone at the table, because you have to that would give you a clearer mind as to how to come up with a solution. And I think that's part of the problem that we have now as it relates to the divisiveness or the separation of many people, is because it's so one-sided. It's so, the right does this or the left does that. It's always, no matter what happens, no matter what nobody says, I'm sticking to this because I'm a Democrat. I'm sticking to this because I'm a Republican, without really looking at the whole concept of what is happening. So I would say, certainly from the black woman aspect, the black woman has been seen a lot of things. Not only is she female, but she's black, so it's a double whammy, I guess you would say. But to hear from them, I think is a wonderful thing, because they have experienced it. Sometimes it's very difficult for someone to give any kind of information on something they've never experienced. I've never been through that. How can I tell you how to deal with something I've never been through? So I think as a whole, I think everyone needs to be at the table.
Thank you so much again for being here today. It seems to me that in a lot of ways we're trying to solve a problem with policy and monetary solutions, and there's also a need for an emotional or a spiritual healing as well of race relations. How do you propose that we move forward in those arenas?
I'm so glad you asked that question. That is really the piece. As I began with, Martin Luther King Jr., his spirituality, his faith, his belief in God is what took him through. And I believe that it's necessary that we go back to the foundations, even the foundations of our nation, and to look at who we are, how this nation was created, and look at it from a spiritual aspect. And so many people don't. When you see poverty, when you see these things that are transpiring in our nation, and then you see people who are supposedly leaders in the spiritual domain, and they're not speaking against it, or they're going with it, it causes you to think, well, Jesus believed in love, Jesus believed in justice, and how can you support something that is against what Jesus believed in and still sit behind the pulpit and stand behind the pulpit and preach what you're not practicing? And so I think that we have to go back. Dr. King wrote a sermon called Rediscovering Lost Values. And he said in order to move forward, many times we have to go back and really discover some situations where we have to go forward. He used for an analogy, he was going to Boston one day, and he got off the road, and he took the wrong road, and he talked to somebody, and they said, well, in order to get where you're going, you got to go back 12 miles, get on the right road, and move forward. So I think we as a nation, from the spirituality aspect, that we have to go back to our basics and to reality and say, look, this is who we are, this is where we were built, and so let us go in that vein. And I think it would be much more effective than politics that is representative of a lot of division.
First of all, thank you both so much for being here. I have so much respect for all the amazing work that you do, both of you. And I know this is a sensitive topic, but I want to know what are your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement. And since I'm a student that came from California, the Bay Area is a very, I guess, concentrated area of liberals. And I've seen, many of my classmates participate in the movement, and I've always had a lot of thoughts about it, and I didn't really know where I stood with the movement because, obviously you want to support this empowerment of, minorities, especially African Americans, and on the other hand, you're seeing this, I guess in some senses, this exaggerated form of police brutality that, in some cases is happening, but in some cases is not thoroughly, I guess, investigated and is not thoroughly presented to its fullest extent. So I just wanted to know, I know it is a sensitive topic, but I just want to know some of the thoughts that you might have on the particular issue.
Okay, as it relates to Black Lives Matter? Okay. Black Lives Matter, I support any organization that works toward the betterment of people, regardless of who they are, where they come from. I think some of the things with Black Lives Matter that take people apart is its name in itself. And sometimes when you hear, just like Black Power, when you hear the name, it gives you that assumption of superiority. And as King said, black superiority is as dangerous as black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy. And I'm convinced that God is not interested in the freedom of black men or white men or yellow men, but God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race and the creation of a society. And so as it relates to Black Lives Matter, I think sometimes what they're saying, and we have to try to understand people, but what they're saying, they're not saying that other lives don't matter. They're saying what they're seeing in the nation is as if black lives don't matter, and we just want to remind you that they do. And that's the concept that they have. I haven't followed Black Lives Matter a lot. I know I guess positives and negatives of what has transpired there, but I think the bottom line is they want to bring the awareness that black lives do matter, because they see so many things, just like I mentioned Eric Garner and others, that we have all seen that we know is not right. And so they got to a point where they said, look, we just have to stand up and say, look, that we can't continue to accept this injustice.
One over here.
Thank you very much. It was your performance was outstanding, and I would hope that all of those, however many millions of people who are alive today who weren't alive then, have the opportunity to hear you do that. It was fantastic. What I would like to know is, what would Dr. King think today about the discussion around reparations? It's a topic, and I'm just curious what you think he would say about that.
That's a good question. I think that he would be for reparations. It's a very contentious subject. And we know the history, and we have to be real about the history of this nation. And I was listening yesterday when the gentleman was talking about wealth in the nation and how wealth started, and he started with 1800. And he totally skipped over 1619 when slaves were brought to the U.S. For more than 2 centuries, slaves were worked for free. If you think about 20 million times $70 a week times 200 years, it comes out to about $50 trillion. That was free labor. And that's how this country was built economically from the beginning. But so we can't look over things. We have to be real about what happened in the history of the nation. And once we are real about it, then we can see it much more. But when you hear that, oftentimes people are saying, I don't get it. I mean, did you just totally forget about that piece of history? I think he would certainly be for reparations. It's kind of hard to determine because it's been so long, but there are blatant things that transpired where, and I can go into many of them, but it's obvious that, their land was stolen, their free labor, all this transpired. And if we can, in the places where we know, repair that, I think that it is necessary to do it. And I think Dr. King would support, even the Bible talks about restoration, restoring a person back to that wholeness. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the slaves were free, but they weren't given any land, they weren't given any money to make that freedom meaningful. And so they were it's like a person being in jail for 200 years, and you say, we're sorry that you didn't really commit the crime, so you're free to go. They have no job, no employment, they have no clothes, they have nothing, and they have to build from that. And when we don't look at that and we just totally pass it over, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice as it relates to trying to make matters better. So to answer your question, I certainly believe he would be supportive of reparations to a certain way.
We have time for one more quick question. Have one in the back there.
What is your position on reforming or the solution of the black family? How would you do that?
And just since this is the last question, I'd love to also, I think it's a very good question. It ties into something I wanted to talk about, the role of faith in this. He was asking how we can, about the role of the black family and help keep them together. And I really, on that note, see faith as, the underlying thing that could bring both sides together on this. And in your experience inside the church, how can faith play a stronger role in both families and restoring some sort of peace in regards to our racial tensions?
I think faith is ultimate. For King, faith was ultimate. It was ultimate that, he went day in and day out with threats on his life for standing up for what he believed in. So faith is, I'm a minister of the gospel, and faith is the peace that has brought me to where I am. Faith is crucial in bringing all together. As far as it relates to the family and the restoration, I believe that it is necessary not just for the black family, but for all families, that we delve into that faith piece and we be real about what it is that we believe and that we say we believe. We can't say one thing and then do another. Action speaks much louder than words, and sometimes I can't hear you because your actions are out speaking your words. So what we have to do as a nation, I believe the underlying fact. The bottom line is love. And some people don't believe it. They didn't believe King when he said, love will take us over. It's a love piece. Well, nah, we can't. But it happened, and it worked, and they did it non-violently. Anyone can say, if you do something in a negative aspect, or if you do something on anyone could say, well, that's the way that they are. That's the way those people are. But when you do it in a loving manner, Jesus is love. God is love. And the word tells us that he who says he knows God and does not love does not know God, because God is love. And if we don't take it back to that foundation, but I think it's certainly a positive fact in our lives, our everyday lives, and our families. Many of our families have been separated as a result of many of the things that we have experienced historically. But at the same time, that can't be used as an excuse. You got to think, for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. But yet, out of bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. And they did that based on their faith.
Well, thank you so much. You have such a gift. I feel so privileged to have been able to experience that, and that's what it really is, hearing you reenact that speech. It's an experience. So thank you to Jennifer for bringing you in, and thank you for all that you're doing and sharing that with us.
Thank you.